Good morning and welcome to the weekly review here on Teachers Talk Radio. My name is Tom Hopkins-Burke, and joining me to review the week in education this week, we have Nathan Ginn, we have Leanne Lax, and we have our first-time reviewer, Ben Thomas, as well. In the news this week, school buildings are on the verge of collapse, and this could cost lives, according to trade unions. So is your school building falling down, and what can we do about it? Teachers in Wales are back on strike, having rejected the latest pay offer from the Welsh Government, and Welsh leaders are working to rule. What can we learn from the industrial action in Wales, and how is it influencing the action in England? And finally, 1 in 5 school children, some as young as 11, have experienced or witnessed sexual harassment while at school, and sexually abusive language has become normalised in British classrooms, according to the most comprehensive study of its kind. It is happening here. So what can we do about it, and how can we mitigate this? Let's start with our first story of the day, though, which is that the government must take urgent action to ensure deteriorating school buildings at risk of collapse are made safe, according to the trade unions. In a letter to the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, a coalition asked for a statement on what steps were being taken to keep pupils and staff safe. Crumbling buildings could end up costing lives if they're not repaired, according to the NAHT. The others that signed the open letter were the NEU, NASWAT, Unison, Unite, GMB, and the Community Union. They say it's truly shocking that a Department for Education report conceded that some buildings were at risk of collapse, particularly those buildings built in the years 1945 to 1970. And the DFE has admitted that the risk is worsening, and the unions say the situation has reached absolute rock bottom. So crumbling school buildings. Leanne, does this resonate with you at all?
Thankfully not. I've worked in some very nice school buildings, and I feel like I would imagine it's not that they don't have the money, it's that, they want to fix it. Some schools just can't. Some schools just don't have the finances to fix it. But then I think about the children and what we expect of the children. And we want things like perfect books, perfect presentation, beautiful handwriting. And I think if you're in settings that don't promote that and kind of don't mirror that, then it's hard to expect that from the children. I think it's hard to be inspired by settings that, don't provide you with a creative space or a clean space to think.
Nathan, do you agree with this idea then that actually, the quality of a school building and sort of, on the outside and the inside is an important factor in how well students learn and how much they learn?
Yeah, I agree with Leanne there. There's a theory in criminology called the broken windows theory. And I think it was in the 80s in America, they left a car on a street and it was left alone mostly. And then they left the car on the street with one broken window and came back a week later and it was trashed. And I think we see that in schools. If you're in a nice environment, people respect it more. As soon as it starts getting damaged, and through no fault, I know some wonderful site managers, wonderful site teams who try their best to look after it. It's just, at some point things need to be replaced. You can't keep just fixing, can't keep just cleaning. Things need to be replaced. And I don't think there's the money in the budgets to do it. I think it's a really, really tough situation for schools.
Thank you for that, Nathan. Ben, does this story worry you at all? Crumbling school buildings at the risk of collapse? You are on mute at the moment. And now you've left the bit. Oh, and now Ben has left. I'm sure he'll be back in a short second. Leanne, back to you then. I mean, you're not personally affected by this in terms of the buildings that you've worked at, but does this worry you at all, the fact that actually, if we have a look at the statistics here, it's about this aero bar building material in terms of anything, 150 schools are suspected to need extensive investigation. At least 41 schools across 15 local authorities have this aero bar concrete, Leanne. Does this worry you in terms of what could happen next?
Yeah, I think it's terrible for these children that are in these schools that it just doesn't seem fit for purpose. I feel like a lot of the topics come back round to money, and it makes me wonder, do we need head teachers in schools or do we need accountants,
Ben, welcome back. What was my question? Does this story worry you at all about crumbling school buildings?
Yeah, I mean, I work in a school currently that is fantastic, but every time it rains, I wander around with gaffer tape and a bucket, to make sure that the ceilings aren't leaking. It's very, very difficult, and I think, as you guys have alluded to, you either spend money progressively, so you don't have to have this huge outlay all in one go. It comes down to ring fencing money that schools don't have, but the thing that baffles me is that obviously all these schools were built at some point at the same time, really. And it's a little bit like a house. When you've replaced certain parts, when that's due to be replaced again. What progressively has happened over the years is that because schools have been stripped of budgets and money, the money hasn't been there to replace certain parts of the schools that need replacing, and they turn into huge problems. So it's very, very frustrating. I think it ultimately comes down to how money is used and where money needs to be put in, really. Glue sticks are very expensive these days, so you kind of go for those rather than the building. It's one of those.
Yeah, so I'm not going to say anything about Twinkle that could get us in trouble here on Teachers Talk Radio. One of my colleagues has a theory that basically the better your school's Ofsted report, the more crumbly your buildings are. As in, the schools which have had a worse Ofsted report have received the funding to actually modernise and renovate and improve their school buildings. Have any of you heard of this at all? Is it?
No.
Is it no? Oh God, I've swore the black faces.
Is it the mentality of like, if they can do it in this building, they can do anything, kind of?
Well, yes, I think that would make a fantastic Teachers Talk Radio Investigates in the long term future when we all have time to do this, which at the moment we don't. So that was our first story. We might get a video moving us on to our second story, but given that it didn't work the first time, I'm not sure it's going to work the second time. Hooray, praise be. Thank you very much, Tom Rogers, with that in the background. Second story of the day. Teachers back in Wales are back on strike on March the 2nd, having rejected a renewed pay offer from the Welsh Government. The new offer, according to the NEU, was just not good enough. Hundreds of schools in Wales shut on the 1st of February as teachers walked out of a classroom over the initial 5% pay offer. The Education Minister in Wales, Jeremy Miles, came back last week with a further 1.5% pay rise offer and the offer of a one-off cash bonus also equivalent to 1.5% of a teacher's salary. The NEU postponed planned strikes for 14th of February. While that was put to members, they have come back with a resounding rejection, and a similar offer has also been rejected by ambulance workers who are members of the Unite Union. Joint General Secretary of the NEU, Kevin Courtney, said, in good faith, the union postponed the day of action whilst we conveyed full details of Jeremy Miles' offer and sought feedback from members in Wales. They have emphatically informed us that the offer of an additional 1.5% added to teachers' pay plus an additional 1.5% lump sum is simply not good enough. We have a clear mandate for strike action that is now rescheduled for the 2nd of March. Nathan, you are the Welshman amongst us here. Are you at all surprised that teachers have rejected this pay offer?
I'm not surprised they've rejected it. I think it was good. It was good that we listened. We showed a willingness to listen. I say that, it is my union. I should put that out there. We showed a willingness to listen. But ultimately, the worry for me in this situation is if we diverge too much. I moved between England and Wales and back again teaching. I've taught across both, and I wonder what completely separating those pay scales would really do. Where would we be heading in that sense, and what that would do to people moving across. But I support it. That I'm a governor at my son's school, and our head teacher has informed us that she's not taking governors' meetings after 5 o'clock because she's working to rule. And I support that as well. I think there's a lot of goodwill that's being wasted in schools, and people need to start accepting that. I'd like to see more working to rule, though, I think, than strikes at the moment. I'm not sure how far strikes are going to get us.
That's an interesting point. Now, in terms of what's happening in the NAHT in Wales, head teachers, as Nathan said, aren't meeting after 5 p.m. They're not providing cover for striking teachers. They're not receiving or responding calls and emails before 9 a.m. or after 3 p.m. The NAHT officials have said that a lack of details on proposals, timescales, and implementation, coupled with continued concerns over funding, have stalled progress. Should we see more head teachers work and senior leaders working to rule? Would this have more impact than strike action? Let's go to Ben on this one.
Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, I'm going to echo what Nathan said. I think it's really positive that there's been dialogue between the Welsh Government and the Welsh teachers, but certainly what seems to be occurring from what I've read, what's happening in Wales, that head teachers there are kind of a lot more stringent on working to rule, and I dare I say it, a little bit more supportive of what's going on there in terms of the messages that have come out. I would. It's very, very difficult for a lot of head teachers, and I have a lot of sympathy for them in this situation. My head personally would. She won't mind me saying this, hopefully, but she, if NHT in this country would have gone on strike, she would have supported that as well. So they're in a very, very difficult situation at the moment, and we know they don't always get it right, but it's important that there's solidarity, and I think what's coming out of the Welsh head teachers at the moment certainly shows that, and I think there's certain things that the English body could learn from in this particular scenario. So yeah, it's a positive step, but again, if I was working in Wales, I would have rejected it as well and moved on from there.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Nathan and then to Leanne because I want to talk about the Welsh Government, because they've said that it has no money to give to striking teachers. Now, education is devolved. They're given money from Westminster. Is this a good excuse?
I mean, I don't want to start, a civil war or anything, but there is a difference between how money is spent and what's allocated to Wales, and some of that is European funding as well that used to come into Wales that maybe doesn't come in anymore. We know a lot of roadworks have been stopped now. I think there's a lot of questions around how devolved things really are in Wales and where that money comes from, because you can say education is devolved, but if the money we're getting doesn't support that, we can't really make our own decisions on it. So that for me is kind of a bigger political question, but as I say, it worries me that we might go separate routes on this, because it's a very thin border between England and Wales, and your teaching qualification can carry you across both. And what happens then? Because if teachers are paid less in Wales, does that mean everyone working, mid Wales, around Shropshire, is just going to move across and teach in Birmingham? It's a real concern for me what that means if we're going to go our separate ways.
And Leanne, we know that the trade unions are holding out for a pay rise which matches inflation at 10% or greater. Do we think that this is likely to happen, and do we think that the unions might settle for less in the end?
I don't know. I think we ask. It's hard to know what you're going to get, I guess, when you ask for it and when we strike. But it must be, not that I'm political, but it must be a hard decision to decide which industry gets which amount. I would not want to be making those decisions. And again, it just comes back down to money and who gets what. So I think it's a hard one, and sometimes I think that the view of education probably as a country doesn't help. I think in other countries it's viewed very differently. So I suppose strike action would be viewed differently, and pay rises would be different as well. But at the moment, I think it's the view of education in England that's had a bit of a slaughtering recently, unfortunately. I think if you're not on the inside or near to someone on the inside, it's hard to understand the pressures and the stresses of the job. Yeah.
One more thing before we move on to our final story of the day. In negotiations with Gillian Keegan has suggested a number of solutions in her mind, at least, to the issues. For example, changing teacher pay according to subject by subject basis, and also by tackling workload without any suggestions that this would involve any money, that somehow we can cut bureaucracy without any money. Does the government need to get it, just realise that it is a money situation, or can they continue to just be solutions? Nathan?
I think the other stuff needs fixing as well. Like, don't get me wrong, but at the moment we're talking about money, and that is a real concern for a lot of people, is around the cost of living and around pay and just surviving and making teaching a job that people want to do in that sense. I think then after that we definitely need to have a conversation about conditions of service and expectations on people. And I think the government, what I'm hearing, particularly in England, is just it's like they've never stepped foot in a school. It's beyond belief the things they're suggesting as possible solutions that will actually improve teachers' lives. It's parody.
Leanne, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think that it comes a lot down to your senior leadership team and what they think Ofsted want to see. So I feel like if Ofsted had a more like black and white, this is what we want to see. Some schools want evidence in books. Some schools understand that it's changed a bit, and it's not about what's in the book. It's about what's staying in the kids' heads. I think it would be some schools are easier to work in than others, because I think some SLT teams understand it better possibly than others. And a lot of the stress, I think, comes from that. While money is also a factor, the workload and what your school thinks, let's say Ofsted want, not that that's what it should be about. I think that's a big part of it.
Yes, and certainly the new Ofsted framework, while it's more evidence informed, I suppose, it does place additional stresses not just on senior leadership teams who are always under stress, but on middle leaders as well, particularly subject leaders. Ben, does this resonate with you at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think I think it's very, very difficult, when certain people behave in a certain way, and it comes down to culture. I think it's vital that there is more of a kind of a sticking together process whilst people kind of living to what their values should be. But ultimately, it does come down to how the profession is valued. I've been doing this for 15 years. It's all I've ever done. It's all I ever see myself doing, touch wood. And my biggest fear is people coming into the profession and looking at that and saying, do you know what, I'll go and do something else. These kind of effectively horror stories of losing really good classroom support assistants and going to work in supermarkets. Nothing wrong with working in supermarkets, but actually they're going to miss out on a generation of children are going to miss out on their skills because they've chosen to work somewhere else for more money. It really is, for me, it's a lot more than pay. And it echoes what Leanne said about the respect level and how this country currently views education at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ben. And so, I think it's time to move on to our final story now. Our final story is that 1 in 5 school children, some as young as 11, have experienced or witnessed sexual harassment while at school, and sexually abusive language has become normalised in British classrooms, according to a study by Citizens UK. More than 6,000 school pupils across the country were interviewed, and the study found that 21% had received nude pictures or other inappropriate images on their mobile phones while at school, and 19% had directly witnessed sexual harassment taking place on school grounds. Of those, only a third said they had reported what they had seen to a teacher, and 12% of those interviewed had themselves been a victim of sexual harassment. Of those, just 34% of those had reported what happened to them. Pupils said they chose not to report sexual harassment because they felt doing so would not make any difference and that the perpetrators would not be punished. The vast majority of those young people who took part in the study were aged between 11 and 16 and under the age of consent. The study, coordinated by Citizens UK, took in the views of children at schools run by 10 large multi-academy trusts. Multiple instances of harassment, particularly of female pupils, were reported across all of the schools. Now, it is happening here. That is the mindset and the approach that we have to take. So what on earth can we do about this? Ben, let's start with you.
Well, I think of all the stories coming out, in the last few weeks, this one is the one that's the most concerning for me. And I think the language around, that keyword normalised is frightening. It's not, luckily, it's not something that I identify with on a regular basis, being based in primary. I think the other really concerning thing was that students felt that it wouldn't make a difference if they reported it, and that as kind of a thread of this review really this week is the culture. If schools and school senior leaders aren't going to take any stringent responsibility for calling that out, then there is no hope for the pupils in that school, because actually if they're not going to punish that and come down at that hard, it sets the tone for any other type of behaviour to kind of be the norm really. And I was really concerned by this report. I really was. And my instant response as a parent of a 7-year-old daughter was, what would I do in that situation? As a parent of a child at that school, and it was just horrifying really. And I think this really does now need to have quite a significant conversation within those schools about how they're going to move this forward and effectively, stamp this out and really condemn this kind of behaviour.
Thank you for that, Ben. Nathan, the government has said schools and colleges should be safe places for every young person. We expect school leaders to take immediate action when they're made aware of any sexual violence or sexual harassment. We have made RSHE, Relations, Sex and Health Education, a compulsory part of the school curriculum. And our guidance states that schools should be clear in every aspect of their culture that sexual violence and sexual harassment are never acceptable and will not be tolerated. Is this a response? Does this response take into account the enormity and the gravity of what's going on in schools?
I don't think it does. I think we're still coming to terms with what it is, what this normalization of it, and what is normal behavior and what people can expect from their education. I think the thing for me that they need to almost look at doing is changing how people, schools, local authorities, trusts respond to the number of complaints that are raised, and actually completely flip that, remove any sort of danger to a school from reporting it, because by minimizing it and sort of suggesting it doesn't happen at your school, you are doing more damage by far. I would be far rather know that a school was reporting a lot, was taking action a lot. That actually would make me feel safer than make me feel worried. My worry is the schools who possibly are suggesting it doesn't happen here. That's where my worries are for it.
Well, it's made clear in the Ofsted review of sexual abuse from 2021, as well as the latest edition of Keeping Children Safe in Education, that schools should assume that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are happening, whether there are any reports or not. And that is the message coming from Ofsted and from the Department for Education. Now, Leanne, I know you are a reception teacher. Do you think primary schools can do more, particularly in Key Stage 2 and possibly even in Key Stage 1, to educate students around these issues?
Yeah, I know they made PSHE a statutory subject a couple of years back, but I don't think it gets the weight that it needs in school. I think I mentioned it last week. There was a PSHE show. I can't remember who it was, but just talking about how important the subject is, how you need, especially in primary, open conversation about all these topics, even down to reception. I mean, there are ways and means to talk to 4-year-olds about things you would talk to 10-year-olds about. So I think, yes, the conversation should be open from
that was Ben, that was your show, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was Ben. I thought it was Ben. Okay.
anything you wanted to add on that at all, Ben?
No, I mean, I think drawing. I get what Nathan's saying in terms of drawing attention to it, and in terms of a primary setting, we would do more to say, actually, these words are inappropriate in the same way that you would deal with kind of homophobia, racism. There's a really stringent reporting mechanism for those. I think the next level is talking about those in terms of the sexual harassment, the words that you don't use. There's been a lot of information around Andrew Tate and his views, if you want to call them that. So there's always stuff that schools can do. I think PSHE is, well, hopefully, as Leanne picked up on the show, I had one listener anyway, which was positive. But in terms of moving that conversation forward is always vital. It's just, for me, there needs to be a really hard line on people that actually use these words and behave in this way. And the schools calling that out and saying this is unacceptable, this is what the punishment is, and this is how we're going to change the ethos moving forward.
Thank you for that, Ben. That's the end of our final story. We've just got one more little feature to do now. I'm not sure if Tom's going to play the video at this point. He might do. I don't know. And it is time to review the Teachers Talk radio shows from the last week. The four of us have each come up with our favourite show from the week's schedule, and we're going to spend 30 seconds or so talking about each of those now. I'm going to start with Nathan, then do Leanne, then Ben, and then back to me. Nathan, kick us off, please.
Okay, my favourite show of the week was Harry Waters' show, and it was an accidental find because I thought the title said meditation, so I was like, I'm going to listen to this. It wasn't. It was all things mediation, and his guests Ricardo and Ethan, and they were talking. It's something that I'd never thought about before when we're translating from language to language. That actually who you're translating for is important, and they gave an example of when you're looking at a menu, you already know what that person likes. You're going to change the words slightly as they come through you. And I found that a really interesting concept, that we're not just translating word for word, we're actually putting our own cultural influence on it and for the person who's listening. So All Things Mediation by Harry Waters, really good show.
Thank you for that. Leanne, yours now.
Mine was, I believe it was you, Tom. The interview with Peter Matlock about his new book, Conceptual Maths. I picked out 3 quotes that just resonated with me. The first is quite simple, and it's about maths making sense. I think you have to start with real life in maths and make it relatable to the kids. So that really makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. Approaching the subject matter so pupils can see how it builds on the things that came before. And I know when I jumped from year 1 to year 6, I kind of understood which kids couldn't do ratio because they probably didn't understand division. So I just think there's so many links in maths. And I think people forget that you need comprehension for maths just like you do for English. And then the last quote was, the problem is that we sometimes go straight to the symbols. So I think sometimes we just teach arithmetic and forget to explain the why, which is, I think, important.
Thank you for that, Leanne. Ben, your favourite show from last week?
I liked John Gibbs' Future of Education. I think I'm not going to spoil it for anyone because I want them to listen to it. But actually, we can get very caught up in what's happening now. But actually, it's really quite cool sometimes to think, what's it going to look like in a few years, in a couple of months or whatever. And the guests that he had were quite diverse, quite a lot of background and some interesting stories to tell there. So I like the kind of the optimism that was being portrayed within that particular show. I like the kind of the ideas and what they think education will look like moving forward. And the key point really was, what does it look like now in kind of a post-pandemic world, which sounds really dramatic and kind of the Last of Us style, but actually there's a lot of things that need to change, and there were some really good threads out of that. So yeah, for sure, if you go and check that one out.
Thank you, Ben. My favourite show was by Nathan. It was on Thursday, and it was his show with Ellie Costello from Team Square Peg about their new book, Square Pegs, from Crown House Publishing. And it's this idea which resonated with me and actually was quite thought-provoking, that we do, in many senses, have a one-size-fits-all education system, and some students just don't fit into that. So how and why and how can we make education and schooling more inclusive? It was a great show. There were things which I definitely agreed with. There were some things which I had to think a bit more about. But that's the beauty of Teachers Talk Radio. We don't agree with everything we hear. And it certainly made me think about some things more than I had done in the past. So thank you for that show, Nathan. We've had 28 minutes and 40 seconds. So we don't have long left until we go. I just want to say I'm really looking forward to Poppy Gibson's show next Friday with Phil Wheeler from DTech, talking about all things Lego and education. I mean, that's going to be a really fascinating listen on the Friday morning break. And if you're on half term next week, then why don't you listen to that one live when it comes out at 11 a.m. on Friday? I also wanted to say that on the 3rd of March, we're hosting the NEU General Secretary debate with Daniel Kebede and Lee Sweeney. Do check that out on our Twitter profile. We have the opportunity for you to ask a question too. But yeah, I'll see you next week for next week's weekly review with a whole new panel, Lucy Newberger, Joe Fox and Brett Poland. Nathan's going to take a week off, having done the last, how many is it now, Nathan? I think it's 4.
I don't know, but it's my birthday, so I'm having some time off.
Happy birthday to you. Leanne's done 2 in a row, so thank you very much. And Ben, I hope you enjoyed your first one as well. But that's it from me today. I'll see you next Sunday for the next weekly review. Tune in and talk it out. See you later.